All set up for,
Yeah.
okay. All right, welcome. My name is Bradley Flam. I'm the director of the Office of Sustainability at Westchester University. And I'm very glad to welcome you to this, the final presentation in the Spring 2024 Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. Welcome to those of you here in person and welcome to those of you who are joining us on Zoom today. The Office of Sustainability is glad to be able to present this series every semester with our co-sponsors, the Office for Research and Sponsored Programs, and the Sustainability Council's Scholarly and Creative Activities Committee. It's a bit of a bittersweet intro this afternoon because we have had just a fantastic series of presentations this semester, and I'm a little sorry that we're at the very last one, but it's mostly sweet because we have learned so much this semester. We have laughed, we have been inspired, we've made connections, we've brought in students and faculty and staff to talk about the good work they're doing at Westchester University. And today we're thrilled to be able to finish up this semester's series with one of our own. The Office of Sustainability has a sustainability peer education program, and our speaker today, Madeline, Mulcahey, is one of our SPEs. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Maddie Mulcahey.
Thank you. Like Brad said, I'm Madeline Mulcahey, and I'm a senior undergraduate anthropology student. And I'm really excited to be here today. Presenting at this seminar series was one of my first introductions to sustainability my sophomore year. And since then, I've worked at the Office of Sustainability for 2 years. So it's a nice way to be ending out my time here. But today I'll be talking about NAGPRA, which has been the topic of my undergraduate thesis, as well as some research that I've been involved in the past few years. So I will be focusing on the recent amendments to NAGPRA, or the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And I also want to highlight the human rights, sovereignty, and cultural sustainability components of NAGPRA today. So some of my research questions and goals going into this project are: what are the collection and archaeological histories of Repatriation Mound, which is the site that I've used as my case study? And how does this site fit into the NAGPRA landscape? And my goals were to situate that case study into the legal landscape of NAGPRA, to help give it be able to give some tangible examples of some of the limitations of NAGPRA, and also it helped to provide just some more anthropological context to my thesis and helped NAGPRA seem less abstract. And today I also want to discuss the recent NAGPRA amendments that came out in the past couple of months, as well as expand the scope by providing an overview of Indigenous frameworks of knowledge and their compatibility with law. So my methods for this project, I broke into 2 sections, the first being the NAGPRA side. So this involved analysis of the act itself, the recent amendments, and also scholarly articles and books published on the topic of repatriation in NAGPRA. And I also attended a national NAGPRA listening session, which was held by the Department of the Interior, which were opportunities for tribal governments and also anybody to provide comments on the proposed amendments and revisions, which I went to last year. And for the Nature Mound portion of the research, this involved scholarly articles and books related to Nature Mound and also the Adena Culture Complex more broadly. And I also conducted archival research on primary source material at a few different institutions. Grave Creek Mound Archaeological Complex is the NAGPRA Repository Center that I did an internship at last year. And I was also able to conduct research at the National Anthropological Archives in DC at the Smithsonian, which was super cool. So on the right are some of an example of one of his original site notes from this site, which was super cool. And I also used Google Earth Pro just to create a couple maps to help situate Nature Mound. So first, some overview of what NAGPRA is. It stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. It was enacted by Congress in 1990 and signed by George W. Bush. And the intentions were to protect Native American cultural property, more specifically, human remains, associated and unassociated funerary objects, and objects of cultural patrimony, which I'll explain what each of those means on the next slide. But all museums and agencies, federal and local agencies that receive federal funding are subject to NAGPRA. With the exception of the Smithsonian institutions, they follow their own guidelines that aren't under NAGPRA. And what NAGPRA did is establish formal guidelines for the repatriation process. It also criminalized the trafficking of Indigenous cultural property and outlined procedures for future excavations that involved the discovery of Native American human remains and cultural property on federal lands. So the objects included under NAGPRA include human remains, which refers to any physical part of the body of a Native American person. Funerary objects are objects that are connected to death rites or ceremonies that are placed intentionally with or near human remains. And the term associated and unassociated is used, and the distinction between that is that an associated funerary object was intentionally placed near a burial site, and also the location and origin of that site is known, so they have a known affiliation with the collection. And then object of cultural patrimony is also used, and that's an object that has ongoing historical, traditional, or cultural importance central to a Native American group according to their traditional knowledge. For NAGPRA's influences, unfortunately, there is a long history of inhumane treatment of Native American human remains and cultural property that runs deep in American history and was further institutionalized through museums and universities with the collection of, study of, exhibition of Native American human remains and cultural property. And repatriation activities did not begin with NAGPRA, but rather formed the basis of NAGPRA. And before NAGPRA, most states had grave preservation laws, but they proved largely inaccurate to be able to protect Native American burial sites and also encompass the different beliefs and mortuary practices of Native American peoples. And NAGPRA was passed due to the advocacy of and behalf on Native nations in the United States, and is also connected to the larger American Indian movement of the 1960s, which is also connected to the civil rights movement of the time as well. And two acts that helped to form the basis of the intent of NAGPRA include the Archaeological Resources Protection Act and the American Indian Religious Freedom Act. And you will not be pressed to find articles and scholars talking about the limitations of NAGPRA, but it does have accomplishments as well. For one, it facilitated the return of a vast amount of Native American human remains and cultural property. And the Department of Interior also has distributed $56 million in NAGPRA grants, both to tribal nations and also museums and institutions, for research involved with NAGPRA and also for the physical transfer and repatriation or reburial. It has also sparked conversations inspiring a more critical look at archaeology, biological anthropology, the field of anthropology more broadly, as well as museum studies. It's been a way for Native nations to practice self-determination and sovereignty, and has also been a way for individuals to become more involved with museum studies and advocate for themselves and for their tribal governments. And it has also sparked new dialogue internationally, which I think has been really interesting, both about repatriation, but also about the role of intellectual property and Indigenous knowledge, which I will talk about a little bit later. So the limitations to NAGPRA are obvious. I mean, over half of the Native American human remains in museums and institutions that have been reported have not completed the NAGPRA process. So that's over 100,000 Native American human remains. And this is just of last year, 2023. And a lot of people's critiques of NAGPRA center around how it was written from an Anglo-American legal perspective without meaningful tribal consultation. And this has resulted in the lack of clarity and specific terminology, which has created loopholes. So, for example, the term cultural affiliation is used, and some museums and institutions have deemed their collections to be culturally unidentifiable. So that stalls the NAGPRA process and has been a way for them to keep collections in their holdings for over 30 years at this point. The process outlined in NAGPRA can also be time consuming and expensive, both on behalf of museums and institutions, which are oftentimes understaffed and underfunded, as well on the behalf of Native nations as well. A lot don't have the capacity to hold or store or rebury human remains. And they've also had to come up with new frameworks and policies to issues that they have not had for thousands of years. It's an issue that has happened post colonialism. And also NAGPRA and Native nations and their beliefs are not monolithic. And that was an assumption of the original NAGPRA Act. And Native nations have varying death work beliefs around death, mortuary practices, which vary between tribe and between nation, which can make the NAGPRA process more difficult. So for the case study portion of my project, I wanted to use Nature Mound to explore the unique archaeological and collection histories of the sites, illustrate what the NAGPRA process looks like in practice, and also be able to give some tangible examples of NAGPRA's limitations. So this is the location of where Nature Mound is. It's located along the Ohio River, right near the West Virginia-Ohio border on the West Virginia side. And it's located in Marshall County. And 46th MR2 is just, that's the trinomial designation that archaeologists use just to keep sites in order. It was excavated in 1948 and 1949 by Ralph Selecki, who was a Smithsonian archaeologist at the time. And Nature Mound was excavated to make way for the building of a Pittsburgh Plate and Glass Company factory. So a lot of mounds in this area were excavated or removed to make way for industrial and agricultural expansion, a lot of times in the 40s and 50s. So just some basic facts about Nature Mound and its excavation. It contained 51 features, and for my non-archaeology folk, a feature is just like a non-portable context with evidence of a human occupation. So like a fireplace or a hearth. So there can be individual artifacts within that feature, of which about 30 or so contained evidence of human burial or a mortuary practice. And there were over 1,200 artifacts total, which were placed into 5 artifact groupings: polished stone artifacts, rough stone artifacts, chipped stone artifacts, and miscellaneous. And some interesting pieces from the miscellaneous artifacts: there was an effigy bird stone, one bear canine tooth, a preserved textile, which I think was really interesting. And I'm pretty sure it's that those 2 images in the top right, they were preserved under a bed of salt. 708 copper beads and 36 pearl beads. The copper beads made up the majority of the artifacts. And most of the features were situated in the primary mound, which was capped by a secondary mound, which is that looser gravelly soil that you could see in the illustration. And what this means is that it could have spanned multiple generations or occupations. So it was not built all at once, but showed evidence that people came back to it continuously to add to the mound over time. So Nature Mound was part of the Adena culture complex and was constructed towards the end of this time frame. And this time frame or grouping has been debated throughout time about its specific beginnings and end, but loosely ranges from 1000 BC to 200 BC. So about 3000 to 2000 years ago. And Selecki never really explicitly says when he thinks the end, towards the end means. I'm assuming it's more towards the 500 to 200 BC mark. And this was also part of the larger early woodland period. Some more about the Adena. So they occupied the central Ohio Valley from eastern Indiana to western Pennsylvania. And they shared a basic core of material traits and social customs. So that's what that grouping or that term Adena means. And Selecki correlated nature and mound site with Adena because they match 74 of those material traits and customs. And you can see on the map that pink, that more vibrant pink color is the just about the range of the Adena, and those red and blue circle or squares are burial mound sites that were recorded. And then that large orange swath is Hopewell, which were a slightly later occupation. And just the lighter pink color is evidence of maize growing, which has been debated for Adena, but is more relevant for Hopewell. So some of those site or trait elements for the Adena include large earthwork enclosures, ceremonial circles, accretional burial mounds like natrium, and post houses. And I put houses in parentheses because a lot of people debate the application of the term houses and its modern context because we don't have enough domestic data or information to say that people used houses like how we consider what we consider or define a house to be like. And there is evidence of a gradual exploitation of plant foods and plant resources like chenopodium, which is a starcher grain. It's one of the earliest cultivated and domesticated plants throughout the United States. And some common artifacts included flint blades, projectile points, copper beads, and fire clay pipes, all of which were found at Natrium. I just included two more examples of some of those. The large earthenwork features are the most notable feature or element of the Adena. They're also just the most visible too. So most of what we know about the Adena is through the burial context. I think mostly just because of the vast time frame that it occupied and how long ago it was. Some more about the practice of mound building. It indicates a sedentary or semi-sedentary population. It also provides evidence of a social and religious structure. And people believe that mounds held religious and ceremonial significance, and they also required social cooperation and a lot of planning between individuals. And some people also argue that it provides evidence for a hierarchy or differentiation between individuals, not necessarily like a class or like a class structure, class division. And people say that because there's a ton of variability with how the burials are oriented, and just there's a large range of number of individuals and both the sex and age of the individuals found there. But again, there's a lot of variability too, so it can be difficult to apply interpretation to that. And what I also think is really interesting is mounds, river plain location. So there's evidence that people knew and understand how river flooding would impact their funerary structures and wash them away. So it's really common for mounds to be placed on a second or third river terrace, which I think is really interesting and demonstrates a deep knowledge of ecological goings on in that area. And this is a picture of Grave Creek Mound, which is still intact today. I think it's one of the only intact or preserved mounds today. Also located close to where Natrium is in West Virginia. So because a lot of the mounds in that area were excavated in the 40s and 50s, there have been developments both within how people have interpreted that data and also within archaeological methods and scientific practices. So people have questioned previous interpretations of Adena sites. One, mostly because of the lack of data for domestic context. Most of what we know is about burial context, so it can be difficult to ascribe larger cultural traits to a group that we only know about their burials. And the complexity of the ritual elements and just the variability within those elements invites some unchecked speculation. And people also argue against applying a broad interpretation to encompass all of the Adena or all of the Hopewell. And some people argue it's better to kind of look at mounds or different sites and event as individual actions and less as something that we're able to apply a broad interpretation to all of what that culture encompasses. And from here, I want to go into the process of NAGPRA and how nature mound fits into that. So NAGPRA is facilitated by the National Park Service, which is housed under the Department of the Interior. And compliance documents for NAGPRA include itemized lists, inventories, notices of inventory completion, summary, and Federal Register notices. And these are just some general steps. They can vary based on what objects you have, but in general, it would involve compiling an itemized list, completing an inventory or summary, and submitting a notice of inventory completion, would be published on the Federal Register. So tribal governments have people that monitor that site. And also from here is where tribal consultation would begin. So museums and institutions can also initiate tribal consultation. And after that process is when a notice of intent to repatriate would be filed. And the National Park Service and National NAGPRA do publish templates for these documents. I just put the templates for them. I didn't think it would be appropriate for me to put the ones that I filled out with data from Natrium, but it's just an example of some of the components that go into that and what they're looking for. So some of the issues that I faced with Natrium, one is working with an incomplete legacy collection, and a legacy collection means a collection has often been in museums or universities for generations, and there is not clear collection histories that are recorded or transfer histories. And a lot of times, at least in the case of Natrium, they're at a NAGPRA repository in West Virginia, but there are pieces of that collection that are missing from what we have seen in Selected Site Report, and that have been at different institutions. So that can be difficult as well because places will want to wait until they have a complete collection to begin tribal consultation. And also with the Adena provides a unique challenge for establishing cultural affiliation because of how old the collection is. And it can be difficult to, connect to a current day tribe that has the capacity and an intent to rebury or transfer, rebury, or repatriate the remains. And also time. One of the standout issues with NAGPRA just is how long it's taken. And it's interesting when you look back, it was passed in 1990, you can look back in like literature and there's articles, NAGPRA at 10 years, NAGPRA at 15, NAGPRA at 20, 25, and we're at 30 this year. But and I mean, this is a collection that I started working on in my sophomore year. So it's been over 2 years that I've been working on it. It's still like not come completely to a close. So yeah. And from here, I want to focus on the amendments to NAGPRA and what that means for repatriation policy and practice moving forward. So the amendments were announced in December 2023 at the White House Tribal Nations Summit and went into effect in January of 2024. And their goal overall was to streamline the requirements for institutions to inventory and identify Native American human remains in their collections and cultural property. And the main difference between the original NAGPRA and more recent amendments is the tribal consultation that was involved. So they held national NAGPRA listening sessions that I was able to attend, and they received over 1,800 public comments, a lot of which were from tribal nations or from museum practitioners more generally. Some of the highlights or main features of the NAGPRA amendments are they strengthen tribal entities' authority by deferring to indigenous knowledge. I mean, previously more emphasis had been placed on scientific knowledge or historical data over oral histories of indigenous peoples. It also requires institutions to obtain free, prior, and informed consent before allowing the access to research on or exhibition of Native American human remains directly from lineal descendants or from the tribal nation of their origin. The new amendments also eliminate that culturally unidentifiable category and replace it instead with geographic origin, which that had been a significant loophole for institutions previously. And replacing it with geographic origin makes it more easy to connect with a tribe to initiate consultation with. And there's a tool called TDAT, Tribal Directory Assessment Tool. And you can put in a location or just a county if you don't have it more specifically, and it will show you what tribal nations have claims or connections to that land. And it'll also give you their preferred contact. So maybe their tribal historic preservation officer or their chief or whoever they want you to contact, which make things a little bit easier on behalf of tribal nations and also for museums and institutions. And they also require institutions to consult and update their inventories within 5 years. And originally it had been proposed to be 2 years, but that was one of the main comments from the listening session, that 2 years would not be enough to have meaningful tribal consultation. And that strict deadline was one of the initial problems with NAGPRA. In 1990, their deadline was either 5 or 10 years, which proved ineffective. And I also wanted to expand the scope and discussion of this project by talking about Indigenous frameworks of knowledge and the law. And NAGPRA has sparked really interesting discussions about the compatibility of Indigenous frameworks of knowledge and the American legal system more broadly. People are very critical about it, and mostly because of just the disparity of the intentions between NAGPRA and its results 30 years later, has also prompted international discussion about repatriation policy and practice. And just the images at the bottom, the one on the right is a panel from, I think from UPenn, just about international repatriation. And then the one on the left is from the United Nations and talking about repatriation under the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is from 2007, so post original NAGPRA. And it has also sparked really interesting discussions about intellectual property and in traditional knowledge as well. So many people are critical of American legal system and its ability to accommodate and incorporate Indigenous perspectives. And as a contrast, some scholars have offered throughout the years literary narratives and poetry as opportunities to reimagine and re-theorize NAGPRA, help to contrast some of the bureaucratic sterility of repatriation law, and help to explore the human qualities of repatriation policy and practice. So these are really interesting. They're 3 fiction novels or works of poetry, all from Indigenous authors that kind of reanimate human remains or go into more detail about different tribal nations' beliefs and practices surrounding death and death work, which are really interesting, and all of them post original NAGPRA. Others call for more broadly, more interdisciplinary conversations surrounding repatriation and Indigenous scientific interactions and legal interactions, also transparency, respect, human decency, and humility. And while I think the argument and belief an emphasis on the limits in Western Anglo-American legal language to encompass the lifeways and traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples, I think it's very valid. And I think it's incredibly relevant. And I mean, it's evident in just how long NAGPRA has been around and has been largely ineffective. But I think it also offers an opportunity to change the narrative and change perspectives on that issue, because Indigenous perspectives and knowledge just have largely been absent in the United States' legal framework. And I think that movements that people have made towards incorporating Indigenous knowledge into legal frameworks, including the advocacy involved in NAGPRA and the recent amendments, can help to strengthen the sovereignty of tribal nations and also make us more resilient to facing some of our future's most pressing issues. So I wanted to bring in this quote from UNESCO about cultural sustainability, and it says, just as culture and creativity can help us recognize our environmentally destructive behaviors, they can also inspire creative solutions and stronger policies. And together we can build a more resilient and sustainable future for all. And I thought this was interesting because I've seen culture sometimes as a fourth pillar of sustainability. And for those who might not be familiar, social, economic, and environmental sustainability are oftentimes considered the three pillars, or sometimes are a Venn diagram of sustainability. But it was interesting seeing this, them add culture kind of as this like all-encompassing circle to the Venn diagram, which I think is really interesting. And I mean, like, who are we as people without culture? And I think law is one area that lags behind cultural or societal changes or shifts. And we have seen the incorporation of Indigenous knowledge and also just sustainability within other fields and within other areas. And I think one really good example of this is within federal agencies addressing increasingly devastating and destructive wildfires on the West Coast. And people are looking at different ways to manage this and help solve this problem moving forward as it become more of an issue. And federal agencies have been looking towards traditional ecological knowledge of Indigenous peoples of California and on the West Coast about their cultural burning practices, and have been incorporating that into wildfire management, which I think is really interesting. And I also wanted to bring in an international model, just to kind of show how the idea of incorporating Indigenous knowledge into policy frameworks or into legal frameworks is not new. It's something it's fairly new for the United States, but it has been practiced other places, including Canada. I think they've done a really interesting job. And this is an example. It's called the Indigenous Knowledge Policy Framework for Project Reviews and Regulatory Decisions. This is from 2019, and it applies more towards like climate impact assessments, navigable waters, fish and game, and stuff like that. But it was based on that UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and its goal was to create consistent protocols for engaging with and incorporating Indigenous knowledge into Canadian legislation. And it's based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, partnership, and renewed nation-to-nation relationships. So yeah, I just wanted to end with that and kind of be able to expand it beyond just the scope of NAGPRA as well, and highlight what I think are some of the key issues for NAGPRA and its relevancy to sustainability. That's everything I have to share with you guys. But I think we have like about 10 minutes or so. If people have questions, I'd be happy to answer.
So I'm curious, similar like how Canada produced the outline for incorporating Indigenous perspectives of legislation. Has there been any like discussion on incorporating an indigenous perspective into research itself? Like, I've done research on serpentine barrens, and a lot of it is like says that there's you know, they insinuate that there was burning done by Native Americans in that area based on like the broader region, but there's, you know, there were different nations in that area. So I'm just curious if like, I guess there's a protocol for just kind of making inferences on the Native practices within research. Does that seem to be like, I don't know, define that, I guess, perspective of that topic, but it was all based on inference.
Yeah, that's interesting. They do have like 5 protocols or kind of outlines or goals. I don't remember all of them off the top of my head, but it did like specific, I was impressed by how like specifically they outlined how they would go about interactions with that and not just saying like, we are going to incorporate indigenous knowledge into our legal policy frameworks. But what they did say is that, they have a responsibility to reach out to tribal nations first, but tribal nations do not have to tell them anything that they don't want to. And they can also they have control over what knowledge gets incorporated into those decisions or those practices and what is made public from those, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So like from when I read that, they were trying to give more agency to Native nations, but also like set a precedent that they have to interact with them.
Yeah.
In order to like develop those scientific
Yeah.
objectives or
Yeah.
practices that they have.
Yeah,
moving
I really
forward.
like read some research where it's like they're like taking like perspectives and tools and knowledge from traditional knowledge, but like really just kind of framing it around like what they're trying to, I guess, you know, find in their research. I know it doesn't seem like they're really bringing in voices that like actually, you know, or have knowledge on the practices.
Yeah, I think theirs was interesting and they kind of summarize it pretty well. I think it's just under the protocols category, but I thought it was really interesting and like a solid model. But yeah, I don't know a lot more specifics on the topic.
Thank you.
I'm curious about this idea of culture being a 4th pillar of sustainability. I think that's a really interesting idea, and I'm wondering if you could just expand a little bit on what that looks like and how it might change our understanding of sustainability moving forward.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to consider it as like a 4th pillar, and I've heard it described like when you know, without one standing or like 4 legs of a chair or something, you know, it'll fall over without it. And I liked this Venn diagram, and I like showing how they're interconnected and not separate. Because I think the cultural elements and just encompass all, you know, social, economic, and environmental elements as well. And I think, yeah, being grounded in anthropology, I just think that culture is such like it's just I think it's what makes us human. And having that human element is really important moving forward with different, you know, addressing the sustainable issues of the future. Yeah, and I think that example of incorporate and looking to culture as a way to advance sustainability moving forward. And I also think it can be looked at as like a goal. Like if our goal is if for something to be truly sustainable, if it's sustainable from a social perspective and from an economic perspective and from an environmental perspective, it's sustainable as a cultural perspective too. I think that's something to look at as well.
Just looks like Professor Wanko has a question.
Hi there. Thank you for this talk. It's wonderful. And I kind of wanted to follow up on that idea of cultural sustainability that you and Brad are just talking about, because for some reason it hit me wrong. it hit me wrong because it seems to me that it's, well, kind of already covered in social and in the kind of interchanges that the Venn describes and when it overlaps with the other two. But also I was thinking that it's just a very human-centric, anthropocentric way of thinking about sustainability. And this is a question way beyond like the scope of your talk, but I just wanted to point that out, that if we think about cultural as this all-encompassing thing, it describes the way human beings interpret the world. And for me, and for thinking about things like deep ecology, it continues that anthropocentric approach to, you know, how we deal with sustainability. So it's just a comment. It's not really a question. So thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, I was looking at this from the perspective of NAGPRA, how you know, connecting NAGPRA with sustainability more broadly, and NAGPRA has been a way for, and I was looking at this more of a, you know, from an indigenous perspective of NAGPRA in being a way for indigenous nations to practice self-determination and to practice sovereignty. So that is what I was thinking for cultural sustainability is for the, you know, speaking, I think beyond social just seemed a little bit, it seemed more broad to me. And when I have been reading about cultural sustainability and what that means, that really spoke to me. And I think it's another way to look at the models of, or the three pillars of sustainability, maybe from a more indigenous perspective as well, because and from like an indigenous perspective of culture and the environment are like, you know, inherently tied together. And I don't think that framework or worldview is, I think it incorporates more how related we are to the earth, and not necessarily separating humans from the earth. Like, to me, culture from that perspective seemed to be more encompassing and more inclusive.
Yeah, I think there's opportunity in this idea of culture as another pillar of sustainability to recognize some of the very human-centered assumptions that we make from our culture that we just don't always recognize, and then to encompass other cultures' ways of thinking about these issues, I think not only expands our understanding of what sustainability might mean, but helps us see through some of our own blind spots. I think it's a really rich idea. Other questions?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I know that you are interested in going to law school and pursuing that as a career. Do you see this type of work as something that you want to pursue, as something different? I'm just curious, like, how it fits into your goals and interests for the future.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was one of the reasons why I wanted to go into law school, because I was able to see how legislation and how advocacy can help to protect you know, indigenous human rights and sovereignty and sovereignty and self-determination. And so NAGPRA is considered like to be under like a federal Indian policy, which I'm really interested in. I'm interested in policy at that scale. It also like sparked an interest in international human rights as well, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, no, it's definitely, and it also, it helped me realize that I don't want to be working on the side of from a museum studies or from an anthropologist side, because working with human remains is really draining and emotionally heavy. So yeah, it definitely fits into that larger, yeah, my larger goals.
I'm curious if Westchester University's Archaeological and Anthropology Museum has had some challenges with NAGPRA. Is it an issue for the collection that this university has in their museum?
And everything that I have, worked with in our museum is compliant with NAGPRA. And I think our institution has done a really good job at being accountable, and I don't think there are not any issues that I have.
It hasn't been around since the 19th century.
It hasn't been around since the 19th century. I have one last comment. I feel like I'm monopolizing. It was interesting to hear you talk about NAGPRA and the criticisms of the original act and how the amendments are addressing some of those criticisms. It reminds me a lot of the narrative around the National Environmental Protection Act, which has many accomplishments, has been criticized in many ways, but one of its accomplishments, I think, is that it has sparked an interest in the issue of environmental protection internationally in ways that it might not have. And it sounds like you were indicating that NAGPRA has also had a similar impact internationally. Did I understand that correctly? Is that the way you understand NAGPRA's international impact?
I think so. One, because the United States was one of the first, if not the first, to have a federal policy about repatriation of indigenous human remains. So that's one of the, just have that being the basis as well, but also the discussion has since then been centered around how ineffective it is and how moving forward other nations can, address that, or if that makes sense.
We are at 12:50 and we usually pause here because some people have to get to classes, some people have to get to other things. If you have a few more minutes for any more questions afterwards, but before that, let's pause and thank Maddie Mulcahey one more time.